Hash Cowboy's children were starving to death. A homeless widow fed them and gained a husband. The first thing she set down on that table wasn't food. It was a cast iron skillet. Clunked it right down on the warped pine planks, didn't ask, didn't look at me for permission, just set it down and turned back to the stove like she'd been doing it her whole life. Like it was her stove. Like it was her kitchen. I was standing in the doorway of my own house watching a woman I'd found sleeping in my barn set a skillet on my stove, and I didn't say a word. Because my daughter was sitting at that table with her eyes the color of creek mud after rain, that flat, glazed color. And my son was on the floor in the corner with his back against the wall, knees up, staring at nothing. And I hadn't had a thing to give either of them since the morning before. That's how it started. My name is Cal Hester. I worked a small ranch outside of Dalhart, Texas. This was 1887, fall going into winter, the kind of fall where the cold comes early and doesn't apologize. I had 210 acres of hardpan and clay that my father had broken his back on, and that I'd broken mine on after him. And I had a horse worth more than the land. And I had a Winchester rifle that I'd carried since I was 19 years old. And I had 2 children, Nora, who was 9, and Thomas, who was 6. And I had a debt at the Meacham Bank that I hadn't been able to service in 11 months. My wife, Celia, had died of fever the winter before, February. Ground was so hard we couldn't dig the grave until March, and I don't need to say more about that except that it did something to me I couldn't name and couldn't fix, and the ranch felt it the way animals feel a change in the weather. Things started going sideways. The spring calves came small. The summer was dry. I sold everything I could sell and held on to what I couldn't part with. And by October, I was holding a note from the bank with 30 days written on it, and a number underneath that might as well have been a figure in Chinese for all the sense it made to me, given what I had. I wasn't eating much. I won't make a saint of myself about it. I was trying to keep the children fed, and sometimes I managed it and sometimes I didn't quite, and I'd gotten good at not letting them see the difference on my face. Thomas didn't notice. Nora did. 9-year-old girls notice everything and say nothing, and Nora had her mother's eyes, that particular shade of brown, and when she looked at me a certain way it was hard to meet. That's where things stood when I went out to the barn on a Tuesday morning to check the horse and found her. She was in the back corner, the one behind the hay stack, down in the straw with a coat pulled over herself that wasn't warm enough for the weather and a canvas sack under her head. She was awake when I came in. Didn't startle, didn't scramble up. Just looked at me from down there in the straw, straight and level. The way a person looks at you when they've already thought through what you're going to do and made their peace with it. I stood there with the lantern. She said, "I'll go." I said, "Where?" She didn't answer that. Didn't have an answer, I think. She got herself up slow, not hurt slow, just careful slow, the way you move when you've been sleeping on cold ground and your body is reminding you about it, and she picked up the canvas sack and settled it on her shoulder. She was maybe 35, not soft. Her face was weathered the way faces get when they've been outside for a stretch, cheekbones high, jaw set, dark circles under her eyes that weren't just from one bad night. Her coat was wool once good, now worn through at the left elbow. Her boots were cracked at the toe. She walked past me toward the barn door. I said, "You eat yesterday." She stopped, didn't turn around right away. When she did, her face was careful, the kind of careful that's been practiced. "The day before," she said. I thought about the children in the house. I thought about the skillet on the hook and the tin of lard and the half-sack of cornmeal that was all that was left and that I'd been rationing for 3 days. I thought about 30 days on the bank note and the number underneath. I said, "Come inside." She didn't say much that first morning, didn't explain herself, and I didn't ask. She moved around my kitchen like a woman who'd been in kitchens before, not hesitant, not showy, just purposeful. She looked in the cabinet. She looked in the tin. She looked at the cold lard in the skillet, and she picked up the sack she'd brought and opened it on the table, and what came out of it wasn't much. A handful of dried beans, a small paper twist of salt, 3 withered onions, something wrapped in cloth that turned out to be a piece of fatback about the size of a man's palm. But she looked at what was mine and what was hers, and she put it all together like a woman working an arithmetic problem in her head, and then she started. Nora came in from the back room and stopped in the doorway. Thomas came behind her and bumped into her back, and they both stood there looking. The woman looked at them. She didn't smile the way strangers smile at children, that bright, uncomfortable thing. She just looked at them steady and said, "You hungry?" Thomas said yes before Nora could stop him. Nora elbowed him. The woman said, "Nothing wrong with being hungry, come sit." That was the first thing I can tell you about her that mattered. She didn't make them feel small for needing. She didn't perform kindness. She just folded them into it like it was a practical matter, which I suppose it was. Her name was Ruth Calloway. She was a widow out of Amarillo. Her husband, Henry, had been a freighter, wagons, long hauls, the kind of work that pays irregular and runs a man down hard. And he had died in August, a wagon accident on the Canadian River Road, and left her with nothing but what she could carry because the wagon and the mules were hired equipment that went back to the outfit, and the room in Amarillo had been on Henry's credit, and that credit died with him. She'd been moving south and west since September, following work that mostly wasn't there when she arrived at it. A rancher's wife in Tascosa had given her a week's work canning, paid in food. A family in Clayton had let her sleep in their barn one night. The beans and the fatback were what she'd traded 3 days woodcutting for, outside Dalhart, at a homestead along the creek. She told me all of that over supper, the first real supper I'd had in weeks, beans with the fatback rendered down into them, cornbread made flat and fried in the skillet, onions cooked soft. She told it matter of fact, no performance of suffering in it, just the plain facts laid out like she was reporting on someone else's situation. The children listened. Thomas ate with both hands working. Nora ate slower, watching Ruth the way she watched most things, steady and private, and taking it all in. I ate and didn't say much. After she washed the tin plates in the basin, I said she could sleep in the barn again if she needed to. It was out of the wind, the horse was gentle. She said that was fine. She took her coat and her sack and she went out. I sat at that table for a long time after, looking at the place where she'd been. I need to tell you about the rifle. It was a Winchester 73, the Centennial model, the one they'd made to mark the country turning 100, with the octagonal barrel and the walnut stock and the brass receiver that caught the light in a way that made you understand why men fought over such things. My father had gotten it in a trade in 1876. He'd given 2 horses and $30 cash for it and considered it the best deal he'd ever made, and I'd always thought he was probably right. It wasn't just the weapon. There were better rifles for hunting, maybe, and the army had moved on from it. It was the particular thing it was, the feel of it, the balance, the way it sat in your hands like it was made for them. I'd carried it through 7 years and never once thought of selling it. In November, with 20 days left on the bank note, and the cattle already gone and nothing left to liquidate, I thought of it. I thought of it for 3 days and didn't mention it to anyone. By then, Ruth had been with us 2 weeks. It hadn't been planned. The morning after that first supper, she'd come back in and started on the breakfast like there was nothing to discuss, and I hadn't sent her away, and the day after that was the same, and eventually the question of whether she was staying had got answered by the simple fact that she was there. She fixed things, not just meals. She found where Nora's coat had worn through at the cuff and mended it without being asked. She relaced Thomas's boot where the leather had cracked through. She looked at the woodpile one afternoon, and the next morning she was out there with the axe. And by noon the pile was double what it had been, and she came in with her hair loose from the cold and her cheeks red, and washed her hands at the basin, and started on dinner like she'd been at needlework. I watched all of it from a careful distance. I watched my children come alive in the way children do when there is food and warmth and a steady presence. Thomas started talking again the way he'd talked before his mother died. All at once, overlapping, stories about nothing in particular, the kind of noise I hadn't realized how much I'd missed. Nora started sitting at the table after supper and doing the reading Ruth assigned her from the single primer we had, and Ruth sat across from her with her own mending and corrected her without looking up, just from the sound. I watched all of it and I was grateful for it, and I didn't know what to do with the grateful because I'd been alone with it for too long. The rifle sat on the pegs above the door. I rode into Dalhart on a Thursday. The plan was simple enough. The Meacham Bank held the note, and the Meacham Bank would take the rifle as partial payment, which wouldn't settle the debt but might buy another 30 days, enough to figure the next thing. I'd worked it out in my head over several nights. It was a practical decision. That's what I told myself. I tied the horse at the rail outside the bank and went in with the rifle under my arm, and I sat in front of Gerald Meacham's desk and laid the rifle across it and told him what I was proposing. He looked at the rifle for a long time. He was a fat man who'd never worked ground a day in his life, and he knew what the rifle was. Everyone around Dalhart who'd known my father knew what it was, and he picked it up and turned it over in his hands the way a man handles something he intends to own. He said he'd take it, full value against the note, which was more than I'd hoped. He pulled out the papers, and I signed them without letting myself think about it too long, because thinking about it too long would have made me not do it, and I had 2 children at home and 30 days. I walked out of the Meacham Bank without the rifle and stood on the plank sidewalk in the cold and looked down the length of the main street of Dalhart, Texas, and I felt something go out of me that I couldn't explain to you now in words that would make proper sense. It wasn't just the rifle. It was everything the rifle stood for, my father's hands, the years I'd carried it, some idea I'd had about myself as a man who was still standing, still armed, still in possession of something that couldn't be taken. And now it was in Meacham's hands, and I'd signed the paper myself. I rode home, I put the horse up. I sat on the fence by the near pasture for a while in the cold. Ruth came out after a while. She didn't say anything. She stood beside the fence and looked out at the same patch of nothing I was looking at. After a time she said, "Thomas said you went to town." "Yep." She was quiet then. The rifle's gone. I looked at her. She was looking out at the pasture, not at me. "The pegs are empty," she said. "I noticed when I came in this morning." "Paid the bank?" She nodded, still not looking at me. The wind was picking up from the north, and it moved a loose strand of her hair across her cheek, and she didn't bother with it. She said, "That rifle was your father's." "It was." She was quiet again, long enough that I looked away back at the pasture. Then she said, "That was a hard thing to do. Not sorry for you, not what a shame, not isn't that terrible, just, that was a hard thing to do." Like she understood what the doing of it cost, and she was naming it plainly, and that was all that needed to be said. I felt something loosen in my chest, not much, a thread, but something. I said, "I've still got 20 days on the extension, then I don't know." She said, "I know." Here is what I didn't know about Ruth Calloway until December. She had money. Not much, not enough to save the ranch on its own. Not enough to make the kind of difference that would end the story clean. But real money. $31 sewn into the lining of the canvas sack, which was every dollar Henry had accumulated over 3 years of freighting and saving, and which she'd protected through September and October and November by sleeping in barns and trading labor for bread rather than touch it. Because Henry had told her once, told her when they were first married and flat broke, and trying to figure out how to make the rent in Amarillo, that you don't eat your last dollar. You hold your last dollar. You hold it through everything because the day comes when you need a first dollar to start again, and if you've eaten your last, you've got nothing to start with. She told me this in December, sitting at the table, the children asleep, the lamp low. She brought the sack out and worked the stitching open with a small knife and laid the bills on the table one by one. $31 in paper and coin, flattened and worn from being carried a long time. She said, "I know it's not the whole note." I said, "Ruth." "I know what I'm doing," she said. "Don't tell me what I'm doing." I looked at the money, then I looked at her. She was watching me with those straight, level eyes, the same eyes she'd given me that first morning in the barn, the eyes of a woman who has already thought it through and made her peace. I said, "Why?" She picked up one of the worn bills and smoothed it flat with her thumb, a small, careful gesture. "Because this is a good place," she said, "and those children need a good place to stay." She set the bill back down. "And," she said, quieter now, almost to the table, "I think you're a man worth staying with." The lamp guttered. She reached up without looking and trimmed the wick, and the light settled. I sat there for a long time after that, with $31 on the table and the sound of the wind outside, and the smell of the cornbread she'd made for supper still in the air. And I thought about Celia, and I thought about the rifle, and I thought about how a man can lose everything in pieces, so small he barely feels each one, until he looks up one day and realizes he is standing in the ruins of his own life. And I thought about how sometimes a thing you never expected comes in from the cold, and puts a skillet on your stove and stays. I said, "I don't know how to ask you properly." She said, "I don't need you to ask me properly. I just need you to ask me." So I did. We were married in January at the courthouse in Dalhart, with Thomas in his good shirt and Nora in a dress that Ruth had made from a bolt of blue calico she'd traded 2 days of laundry work for. The judge who did it was a man named Briggs who had a cold, and seemed irritated about having to conduct a ceremony in that weather. But he said the words, and we said them back, and that was done. On the walk back to the horse and wagon, Thomas took Ruth's hand without asking, just put his hand in hers and walked. Ruth looked down at him and didn't say anything, just adjusted her grip so his small hand was wrapped properly in hers and kept walking. Nora walked beside me. After a block or so, she reached up and took my hand the same way, quiet, no announcement, and I held on. That's the picture I carry. But I need to back up, because the rifle isn't done yet, and I told you the story runs through it, and it does. Gerald Meacham had the rifle on the wall of his office by December. I'd heard it from the man who ran the feed store, who'd been in Meacham's office for some other business, and seen it mounted up there like a trophy. The way it was told to me, Meacham had shown it off to anyone who came through, told the story of how he'd gotten it, which in his telling was a story about a foolish rancher who couldn't pay his debts and had to hand over his family heirloom to settle them, which was near enough to true that I couldn't argue with the facts of it, only with the spirit. I said nothing. I had the extension, and Ruth's money had bought another 90 days beyond that when we'd brought it in together in December, and I was focused forward, on the spring, on getting a pair of calves that might turn into something by summer, on making the place work the way it was capable of working if a man had his head straight and his hands available. But in February, a thing happened that I hadn't planned for. A man came through from Tascosa named Birch, Denton Birch, a cattle buyer, one of the floating variety who went from outfit to outfit making small deals that added up. He'd been in Meacham's office on some business about a foreclosure property, and he'd seen the rifle on the wall and he'd made an offer on it, and Meacham had turned him down, and Birch was the kind of man who didn't like being turned down, and so he'd gone and found who the rifle had originally come from, which was me, and he'd come out to the ranch to ask if there was any way he could get to it through me. I told him the rifle was Meacham's now. I'd signed the paper. Birch said he understood that, but he also understood that Meacham was a man who liked cash more than he liked wall decorations, and that if someone went to him with the right amount, the rifle could change hands again. He asked me what I thought the right amount would be. I told him I didn't know, and it wasn't my business anymore. He nodded and thanked me and left. I watched him ride back toward town, and I felt the pull of it, the idea that the rifle might come back, that it might be buyable again if things improved enough, and then I put it away. You can't run a ranch chasing what's gone. I'd learned that with Celia the hard way. You grieve it right and you move. Ruth was in the kitchen when I came back inside. She was rolling out dough on the flour-dusted board, and she looked up at me when I came in and read something on my face, the way she'd learned to do, and she said, "Who was that?" I told her. She went back to the rolling, worked the dough out flat and even, then she said without looking up, "Do you want it back?" I thought about it honestly. "It was my father's," I said. "I know, but I signed it away fair." "I know that too." She folded the dough over and started on the second pass. "If it comes back," she said, "it'll come back, and if it doesn't, it was a Winchester rifle, not your father." I looked at her. The flour on her hands, the set of her shoulders, the way she worked like work was its own kind of conversation. "How'd you get to be so sensible?" I said. She glanced up at me then, a quick thing, almost a smile. "The hard way," she said, "same as everyone." Spring came. I want to talk about the spring the way it actually was, not the way you tell it to make a story tidy. It was cold until it wasn't, and then it was muddy, and the first calves came healthy, and I lost one to a coyote in March, and I was furious about it for 3 days, and then I moved on. The garden Ruth put in along the south wall of the house started producing in late April beans and squash and a row of onions. And Thomas discovered that he liked pulling weeds, which was convenient, and Nora discovered that she liked reading to Thomas while he pulled them, sitting in the dirt with the primer open across her knees, Thomas's hands in the soil and her voice going over the words careful and slow. I worked from before light until the light failed most days. There was always something broken or something that needed preventing from breaking, and the ranch was small enough that I couldn't hire help and big enough that one man was always behind. Ruth saw this and didn't comment on it. She just adjusted what she was carrying so that what fell off my side could be picked up somewhere else. She kept the books. Turned out she was better at numbers than I was, which wasn't saying much, but she was genuinely good at it. The way some people are, could hold figures in her head and work them around while she was doing something else entirely. One evening in May, she set a piece of paper in front of me at supper, numbers in 2 columns. She said, if the summer calves all come, and 2 of them are steers and I can sell the steers in the fall at current prices, and if the garden holds through August. I looked at the numbers. She said we could make the note in October. I looked up at her. Not comfortably, she said. But we could make it. I looked at the numbers again. You figured this out when? I said. While you were mending the north fence, she said. I had time. Thomas said something from across the table about wanting more bread, and Ruth got up to cut it without breaking stride in the conversation, which was something she did, managed 6 things at once, and gave each one exactly what it needed. I folded the paper and put it in my chest pocket. I said, you're something, Ruth. She sat back down and put bread on Thomas's plate. She said without looking up, don't get sentimental about it, I just like numbers. There are things I want to tell you about her that don't fit into the run of events, small things. The way she moved in the kitchen in the early morning when she thought no one was awake yet, and I'd come down and stand in the doorway and watch her for a moment before she heard me. The way she argued, not loud, not heated, but with a precision that meant she'd already thought further ahead than you had, and by the time you figured that out you'd usually already conceded the point. The way she handled Thomas when he had a crying spell in the night, not the oversweet comfort, not the scolding, just a steady hand on his back and her voice, low and plain. You're all right here, you're all right. The way she sat on the porch in the evening after the children were in bed and looked out at the plains going dark, her hands still in her lap, just being quiet in a way that didn't ask anything from you. I started sitting out there with her, not talking mostly, just there. One night she said, do you think about Celia? I said yes. She said, good, she was their mother, you should. I said, does it bother you? She thought about it a moment, honestly not performing consideration. She said, no, Henry's with me too. I don't think that's something that goes away and I don't think it should. She paused. I think you just make room. I sat with that. She said, I don't need you to be over it, Cal. I just need you to be here. I looked at her in the dark, the shape of her, the plains behind her going gray and then black. I said, I'm here. She said, I know. The note came due in October, the way she'd said it would. The steers sold at Tascosa in September. Good price, fair weight. The buyer a man named Colquitt who paid without complaint and counted the money out in front of me on the tailgate of his wagon. I rode home with it in my coat pocket, and I stopped at Dalhart on the way, and I paid the Meacham Bank what was owed, and I walked out of that building in October with the paid note in my hand, and I stood on the same plank sidewalk where I'd stood in November the year before without the rifle and feeling gutted, and I felt different now. Not repaired, exactly. Not like the hard year hadn't happened, but like a man who'd come through a thing and was still standing on his own ground. I rode home. Ruth was at the table when I came in, working on the accounts book, the lamp close because the evening was coming. She looked up. I set the note on the table in front of her. She looked at it, looked at the number with the line through it, looked at the stamp. She said, well. I said, well. She closed the accounts book. Outside, the wind had come up the way it did in October, that long, low sound it made across the plains. Thomas was in the barn. I could hear him talking to the horse, some story he was telling it. Nora was upstairs reading. Ruth looked at the note for a little while longer, and then she slid it across the table back toward me. She said, your father would have been proud of you. I picked up the note. I don't have words for what that hit like. I've thought about it since and I don't have them still. It wasn't the note, wasn't the paid debt, wasn't even the ranch, really. It was that she'd been watching long enough to understand what I was carrying, what I'd been carrying since the bank, and before that since Celia, and before that since the land started going sideways, and she'd named it right. Not what I'd done, what my father would have said about it. The people who know what you need to hear, the ones who don't flinch from it and don't make a performance of it either, they're not common. I cleared my throat. I said, I'd have lost the place without you. She said, you don't know that. Ruth. She looked at me. I'd have lost the place, I said, and the children would have gone hungry through the winter and I'd have had to send them somewhere, some relative or the county, I don't know, I'd have. I stopped, looked at the lamp. I'd have come apart quietly, the way men do. She was quiet. I know you didn't come here for me, I said. You came here because there was a barn and you were cold. I know that's how it started. She said, that's how everything starts. I looked at her. She said, a thing starts somewhere. That's not what makes it what it is. She held my gaze, straight and level, the way she had that first morning in the barn when she'd thought through what I was going to do and made her peace. Only now she wasn't prepared to be sent away. Now she was looking at me like a woman who knows where she is and has decided to be there. I reached across the table. She put her hand in mine, rough from the work, warm, the particular feel of it that I knew by then without looking. I held on. About the rifle. In November, a year to the month from when I'd signed it away, a boy came out from town with a note from the Meacham Bank. Gerald Meacham had died in October, sudden, and the bank was in the hands of his nephew, a younger man named Warren Meacham who'd come down from Kansas City to settle the estate and who apparently had no attachment to wall decorations. The note said the rifle was available for purchase at the price Meacham Sr. had paid for it, if I wanted it. I read the note twice. Ruth was across the room, folding laundry, and she looked at me while I read it and looked at me while I set it down on the table. I said, the nephew's selling the rifle. She nodded. It's a fair price, I said, more than fair. She folded a shirt, set it on the stack. I looked at the note, looked at the window. The plains out there going into winter again, the sky that particular pewter gray of November. I said, I think I'm going to leave it. She stopped folding. I said, it's just a rifle. I've got the Sharps for hunting. The Sharps is a better rifle for hunting. I picked up the note. And I don't need to have it back. It's done its work. I set the note down. Ruth didn't say anything for a moment. Then she came across the room and picked up the note and read it herself. She set it back down. She said, are you sure? I said, no, but I think it's right. She looked at me for a long moment. Something in her face that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. She said, I'll write back and say no thank you. All right. She picked up the note and took it to the desk and dipped the pen and wrote 4 words on the back. No thank you, Hester. She folded it and handed it to the boy, who'd been standing by the door this whole time looking at his boots, and the boy went out. I stood by the window. She came and stood beside me, not touching just there, looking out at the same November sky. After a while she said, the Sharps is a better rifle anyway. I said, it really is. Here is what I want to tell you, and then I'm done. My father lived to 63. He worked that land for 40 years, and what it gave him for 40 years of work was the land itself. Just the land, the same dry clay, the same flat horizon, the same hard-going year after year. He loved my mother who died when I was 12, and he raised me alone after that, and he had the rifle on the wall, and sometimes in the evenings I'd find him sitting out in front of the house in the last of the light, looking at the plains, and I never knew what he was thinking and never asked. I think about him now in those evenings when Ruth and I sit on the porch, after the children are in bed, looking at the same plains going dark. I think he was probably doing what I'm doing, just taking the measure of it. What you've got and what it cost and whether it was worth the cost. What I've got is this. 210 acres of hardpan that's slowly coming on, 2 children who are fed and warm and getting an education in this kitchen that's worth more than anything the county school would give them, and a woman beside me on this porch who came in out of the cold and put a skillet on my stove and decided I was worth staying with, when no one else was looking. When there was nothing here but a broke rancher and a couple of hungry kids and a piece of land that might not make it. She decided I was worth it. I think about that. I think about what it means when a good woman, a strong woman, a woman who has been through her own hard winter and come out the other side, and has her own money sewn in her own sack and her own reasons and her own grief. When a woman like that looks at a man like me, a man who's been down as far as a man can go without going under, and she looks at him clear-eyed, not out of pity, not out of desperation, but out of some genuine reckoning she's done privately and come out the other side of. She looks at him and says, that one. I don't know how to tell you what that does for a man, how it settles something that has been unsettled for a long time, how it puts a kind of floor under you. I'm not a man who talks about things like this. Raised not to and old enough now that it's mostly set. But I'm telling you because I think there are men out there sitting on fences in the cold, looking at nothing, and they've lost more than they know how to count, and they've signed things away they shouldn't have had to sign away, and they feel like the world has moved on past them and left them in the dust of it. And I want them to know that it can turn. Not because you deserve it, not because you've earned it in some clean accounting, but because sometimes a woman with a skillet and a sack and $31 sewn into the lining comes in out of the cold. And she stays. Ruth is in the kitchen right now. I can hear the skillet. Thomas is in the barn. He's 15 now, and he works that barn like he was born to it, which maybe he was. Nora is married, has been for 2 years, lives in Tascosa with a schoolteacher named Aldrich who she met at the lending library, and who I was suspicious of until I saw how he looked at her, which is the way a man looks at a woman when he understands he is lucky. The note is paid, the land is ours. The pegs above the door are empty, but I don't look at them the way I used to. I look at the skillet on the stove. And